guys. Good morning. I'm Christopher Greene, or Chris Greene, or whatever you want to call me. This is Aimee, Simone. We're with Indie Labs, and also with Code School, and we have come to give you a little presentation about how requests become responses. So it's going to be a kind of jaunt from browser through the generation of a request, through web server, app server, all the way up through the Rails stack, back down to the client. So it's going to be, we're going to touch on a lot of things. We're not going to get into a lot of how to do this. In the workshop section, you'll have access to Rails for Zombies 2. That'll get into a whole lot more of what or how this stuff works. This is more of what is happening, how to trace it, and give you some vernacular, some nomenclature. Give this stuff.
All right. As Jeff mentioned, this is our workshop page. I'm sorry, just a second. You can check out this page for later. We're going to be posting our slides. There's also a link to our chat room if you want to ask each other questions or answer questions during the session. And there's also the links to the materials that we'll be using during the workshop. So you won't need this right now, but you can go ahead and pull it up if you want to. We're going to go ahead and get started. So as Chris mentioned, we're going to be following a request through the application stack. So we're going to be starting at the bottom with the client, where the request is initiated in the browser, follow it up through the stack, through to the Rails application, until a response is formed, and then we'll be following that response back through the stack to the browser. So what is a request? Well, a request is a set of instructions that tells the server what kind of response we want. So this is an example of a URL that you might type into a browser. This is the example that we're going to be following during our talk. And a request is made up of a number of different pieces. The first one that I want to mention is the request path. So in our example, the /courses portion of the URL is our request path. And this is what's going to tell our server which resource we're looking for. We also have the request verb, or a method. In our case, we're using a GET request. This is a type of request that will retrieve information back from our server. Some other common types of requests are POST, which will send information to the server, PUT, which is really similar to POST, but we're updating information, and then delete, which is pretty self-explanatory. We're removing information. We also have query data. We don't have this in our example, but we could if we were to append some parameters to the URL. For instance, if we were to append page equals 2, this would tell our application that we're looking for something that responds to that page parameter. Maybe if we're using pagination, this would tell the application to return the page 2 set of results. You also have header data. So there's a lot of information that's included in the request header. Some important parts of the request header are the type of response that we want. Or the way that we want the response formatted. So here we're asking for text HTML. We also have some valuable information about who is initiating the request. So we have language, which here is English. We have user agent. We're using Mozilla on a Mac. So a lot of that is really useful information. Okay, so now that we've talked about the different pieces of a request, we're going to start following codeschool.com/courses from the browser to the web server. So just a look ahead, or maybe sort of a spoiler, this is the response that we're expecting when we initiate our request. So we're looking for a page on codeschool.com that's going to return a list of courses. So in our browser, we type codeschool.com/courses. This initiates the GET request from the browser to the web server. What is a web server? This is something that I've mentioned a number of times, but maybe we should talk about what it actually is. A web server, it essentially delivers web pages on the request of clients using HTTP. It also handles the delivery of application content. So in Rails, some examples of web servers that you might use or see are Nginx, sometimes Apache. WebRick is really common. Okay, and then the next step in our request journey is we're going to be following the request from the web server to the app server. So we've made a request to the web server, it was accepted, and now it's being passed to the application server. What is an app server? An app server handles execution of procedures for an application. We're not going to go too much into the intricacies of how this works or of all the different roles that the app server serves, but for our purposes, you just need to know that the app server is going to initiate Rails. Some app servers that you might see in a Rails application are Passenger, Thin, Mongrel. Right, so just wanted to show this again. It's sort of a big description, but like I said, all you really need to know is that it's going to spin up an instance of Rails for your application. Okay, so now our request has moved from the application server to Rails. So we've moved from browser to web server to app server, and now the request is passed to Rails. And I hand it over to Christopher.
Give me the thing. Love this thing. Right, so we've gone through, from the client, the web server has accepted a request. It sees that the path that's been set up is for a particular application. In Apache and Nginx, you'll have kind of modules like if you're a PHP developer, mod PHP or that kind of stuff. Familiar with .NET, and that's the point where kind of the .NET service starts up with a request versus what's happening in IIS and non-integrated mode. So at that point in time, when Rails gets started up with the application server, the request essentially hits this router first. The router is going to tell the Rails application where to route this request actually in the application. So we start with the router. Remember, our request was a GET to codeschool.com courses. This is what a routes RB file looks like. This is how you define routes. Don't worry about the specifics of this. All I want you to worry about is the fact that in this case, we have a resources that we're calling courses, and that's going to result in a match. This only index show, we're talking about actions. Again, don't worry about nomenclature right now. You'll see how it all kind of links together. After this is set up, we can run a command called rake routes, which tells us what is actually generated from this. This is hard to see. In fact, this is impossible to see for most of you. Little easier to see. these individual things are the results of that routes file. This is what is being defined by the routes, of what is being accepted. Essentially what happens is we are looking at a request, the slash courses, that path. We're looking at the verb or the method, and we are looking down this list for something that matches the get and the path. And over on the right side here, which will be blown up in just a second, there is a controller and an action that is being routed to. So this is a little easier to see. So in that long list of stuff, we see that when a router sees a request with the get method to a path of slash courses, it is going to look to that courses controller and an action called index on that. So first step in the cycle, we know where things are bumping up to. So the router has made its decision. Our controller, of course, is action index. And we're going to talk a little bit about what a controller actually is, what it does. So essentially, a controller is a way to combine actions for a particular resource, a thing, an idea, a business idea. In this case, we're looking at courses. The end result is to get a list of those courses back. So actions that would be related to courses would be here. Due to the naming conventions of Rails, the controller that we're looking for, since we know it's courses, is going to be called a courses controller. Some actions that end up being shown with this. Bless you. An index action, which we'll be looking at, which we saw earlier. A show, a create, which ends up going with a post. An update, it's the put. But in this particular case, so if our router had said this action goes to one of these other, or this route goes to one of these other actions, one of these other actions would be chosen. In this case, we know it's the index. And so that's what we're going to look at. Actions. Actions are a place for you to gather information about a certain type of request, a certain type of action. In this particular case, we are wanting to look up a list of courses. We want to look up a list of the paths, a kind of a tree of different learning requirements as well. So we're gathering that information at this point in time to later on be passed to the view. So that is what an action in a controller is for, is gathering that information prior to passing it on to a view, allowing it to render, coming back down the stack. So a little more info about another part of our MVC stack. We've gone through a controller so far, the C in our MVC. And we're going to look at models for a second. A model is just another abstraction of some kind of business object, a business requirement. A user, a course, an order, a catalog item number. In this case, our course, which our little arrow is off a little bit there, but our course is a model. This is a representation of what we are pulling that course information from. The same with the path that we saw. So this is in our gathering of information. This is how a controller, an action, relates to a model. A model is just a thing that gets information. And you can be any number of different things. Most of what you'll see with when you're looking at intro Rails stuff is going to be active record, which is database backed. But it could really be anything. You could have a model of get weather service or get some information from Twitter or Facebook or something else if you want to do that behind the scenes as opposed to on the client. And all of those could be considered models. It's just to keep that kind of logic outside of the controller. So in this case, this model, the courses and path are active record objects, which end up linking to tables in a database that with naming convention, courses, paths. So in our action, when we're looking up the courses, we are reaching out to the database, pulling back that information, generating a list that'll then be passed out to the view to render things down. So, the stack, once more. Request is made. The web server gets it, figures out that it needs to be passed on to an application server for it to start up the Rails application. The application server gets that. There is you'll hear things about metal, about rack. If any of you kind of ears are perking up at this point in time about this stuff. There are other steps in the app server as Ruby is starting to form up, as the Rails process is being built up. There are things, middleware actions that are happening that the last one in that stack is Rails itself. Rails is a rack middleware. Again, it's not something that you need to necessarily worry about. Just know that this stuff exists. In other languages, in .NET, that kind of thing, this would be kind of things that are happening along the HTTP pipeline. So if you are getting a request in and before it actually hits the Rails application, you want to do something, you want to change something, you want to add a header, you want to add some kind of other information, there is a chance for you to do that before it actually gets to Rails, and then once the Rails processing ends, there's a chance to modify that response at the end as well. So just know that that exists. Once Rails is started up and the request information is passed over, the router looks at the path, it looks at the method, the verb, and figures out what controller and what action are going to be called. When the controller action is called, data starts to be gathered in to be used to render whatever your response is going to be, whether that's going out to HTML, which is what we're doing in this case, or XML or JSON or whatever else it could be. So at that point, we've collected our data. And we are ready to have a view render. In this particular case, because of the conventions of Rails, we would be looking for a view in this location, the index.html HAML, because of the way we have our app configured. It could be ERB, it could be any number of things. The action, the index, passes those variables that you've made, the courses, the paths, all those lists, into the view for rendering. The view goes through, it's like a template, a mail merge, if you will, of just going through different information, creating that HTML. And eventually it gets kind of yields back to the index. So the data is written into the response body and is pretty much ready at that point in time to start heading back down the stack. We have not really said what a response has in it, though. So we went over what a request has in it initially, and we said a request tells the server, tells the application what we're looking for and kind of how to process the request. So here's some examples of that kind of implemented here. So in the response headers, the server is bringing back, it's saying, okay, the content type of this thing that I'm sending back to you is HTML. In our request, we gave it a header of, hey, I want to accept HTML. Round trip, right? If our content type could have been, or if our accept header would have been JSON or XML or anything else, the content type coming back you would expect to match up with that and to be able to process it based on that. Another example is in our request, we said our encodings that we can accept from this, we can accept gzip or deflate, which means that the browser that you're using can accept, like, compressed data down. Again, the actual meaning of that is really not important, other than in our headers and our response, it tells us that this is what the server has done for us. We've requested these things, number of things, and this is what is actually coming back. Other things that are coming back in the response header. Cookies. This is where cookies come back, are built into, or how the vector by which cookies get back to the browser is through the response headers. So you're authenticating something, you want to add a little bit of extra data in that response, that's where that data lives, is in the headers. Another thing that comes back with the response is a status code. These are things that you probably have seen, and people really notice 200s, which is great, it's good. It means that everything worked perfectly well, it's great. In requests that are, or statuses that are 300 something, are things like a 301, I think is a temporary redirect, or a permanent redirect. Either way, telling someone like Google, for instance, that this page has been moved over to this other location, right? Or a temporary redirect, something like that. 400s, client error. If you have a form that you want to have validation working on, you push it up to the web server, it says, hey, this crap isn't valid. You've completely screwed this up, this request up, and you want the server to tell the browser that, hey, this is specifically what this error is not that the database is offline or the data center is burning down or something. It's that the request had bad crap in it. 400 series responses come back for that. And then the evil 500 series, you have just 500s, things is broke, panic responses. And there are others, 400 something is I am a teapot, I think, which is wonderful, but you'll probably never see that in action. The final thing you'll see is there is a body, which is just essentially a dump of whatever content is coming back. If you are requesting an image, that body would be the ASCII base64 equivalent of that image. If it's HTML, the JSON will be JSON text, XML, XML text. So what is in the body, in combination with that content type that's coming back, is what lets the browser know, okay, hey, this thing is supposed to be JSON, so I should do something with it in this way, or XML, or HTML, or whatever it might be. Or it's a video file, so we need to pop up a save as box or whatever for you. So when I talk about writing HTML to the body of the response, this is what I'm talking about. It is the payload that's being delivered back down to the client, to the browser. So we're pretty much at the top of the stack at this point. We've gone all the way up. We've gathered our information. We've hit the correct resource. We've hit the view that we wanted to hit. And it's time to start bouncing things back down the stack. It is not a direct route down. The router is out of the picture at this point in time. The controller should be out of the picture at this point in time. Don't need them anymore. Essentially what happens is, after everything's written, you're going back to the app server, the rack application stack. And it's coming back through that middleware I talked about, which gives you a chance after the view has been written that if you want to add an additional header, you want to add some kind of other information to the response before it actually goes out, but you don't want to do it in the context of a controller, of a view, if you want to centralize some of that action. This is an opportunity that you can do that. The app server is done with its with that stack. That response is passed down to the web server itself. The web server at this point in time has kind of kept track of that connection with the browser, or whatever client is being used. And at that point in time, it starts writing response back. Browser gets the response, gets a status code. If you have a 200 there, everything is good. You have a successful response. In a list of items that have come from a model, you're looking at a courses resource that the router was able to get to the right controller and the right action. And it's in the right format because the browser has said, hey, give me HTML back. The server is giving you HTML back.